about to see the second of 3 films which have been made to help us size up our enemy, Japan. To beat the Japanese and to do the job thoroughly, we have got to understand them thoroughly. The Japanese aren't easy to know. I've lived among them for 10 years, and I can testify that they are as different from ourselves as any people on this planet.
Hollywood has a bad track record from way back, of course, showing ethnic minority groups of all kinds. You know, Native Americans, African Americans were always caricatured, almost always. Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans. All these groups were depicted usually in stereotypical ways. There are a lot of exceptions, you know, some good films, but the Japanese character is somewhat stereotypical, you know. And it is controversial, of course, when you have what they call Yellowface now, with white actors doing Japanese parts.
In Hollywood, white actors are really at the top of the food chain. They get access to all the lead roles. They even can play, you know, characters of color.
Lovely ladies, kind gentlemen, pleased to introduce myself. Sakini by name, interpreter by profession.
That is very different from actors of color, especially Asian American actors who rarely even get to play themselves because white actors are sometimes taking that role. And so not only are Asian American actors not part of the lead and being able to kind of build their star power, so then it becomes this cyclical problem where they're not getting cast as leads, and so then they don't become A-list actors, so then people are thinking, oh, well, we can't cast an Asian to play this role because they're not A-list, they're not gonna, you know, be able to draw any audiences, so let's cast an A-list white actor instead to play that. And that has been the historical trend amongst the casting of Asian actors compared to white actors.
Marlon Brando spent 2 months with an interpreter and a tape recorder to acquire the Okinawan accent required for his comedy portrayal of Sakini. Recognize him?
Sayonara.
They're very open to casting white actors as Asian Americans because it's been done in Hollywood, even though it's been offensive. Now they do it in different ways, like, oh, well, let's just make that, all of a sudden make an Asian character, not Asian, but sort of Asian. And that has happened in, for example, Doctor Strange, where they have the Ancient One who was in the comic books written as a Tibetan man, and they cast Tilda Swinton as it, and then they said, oh, well, she's not Tibetan anymore, she's Celtic, right? And except that when you watch the film, it takes place in Tibet. She's wearing very Asian-esque clothing, and the entire scene is obviously set in Asia. And also Scarlett Johansson, who was in Ghost in the Shell, and that was based on a Japanese manga, and that character is a Japanese character. And then they started to say, when there was some protest against this casting, that, oh, she's not really Japanese. But then if you watch the film, it's set in Japan, and it turns out, I think the kind of ending is that she really is Japanese.
There is a strange tradition in Hollywood films. Of course, you know, when you look at old Hollywood films, that's kind of a sign of our cultural imperialism, that we play all parts.
But it is so great, I thought it must show on my face.
What is the cause of this great difference, and when did it begin?
On the night we first opened our hearts to each other, my husband. Even if it is only a girl, I shall be very happy.
In the very, very beginning, even before Hollywood, we can go back a little bit, minstrelsy was something that was a theatrical entertainment that was, it was performed on the streets, and it was performed by white ethnic actors in blackface, in yellowface, and redface. And so they portrayed characters of color in exaggerated, often demeaning, and caricature ways, and it was entertainment. And so that carried over to Hollywood. That was a very, very popular form of entertainment, and it carried over to Hollywood in the early days. For example, in The Good Earth, that was a dramatic, based on a Pearl S. Buck best-selling novel, and so they cast a white actor as the male lead. And at the time, there was this production code called the Hays Code.
This is the day!
According to the Hays Code, you can't have the actors, even if they're portraying Asian, to have any kind of cross-racial romance, right? And so to be able to portray that at all, it makes sense that they would cast white actors. On screen, people of color and whites were not allowed to have any kind of even romantic suggestions. And that happened even when white actors were playing characters of color, right? So even if you have two Chinese characters, if one of them was played by a white actor, the other character could not be played by a Chinese actor, because audiences would understand that that's actually a white actor and a Chinese actor, and therefore they can't have any romantic relationships.
If you love me, if I please you,
It shall be done. Anything.
That was an internal Hollywood code that was based on kind of morality, as well as anti-miscegenation laws that were happening in the United States, where people, whites and people of color, were not allowed to have marital or romantic relationships in the United States. And so they did this in order to make sure that the audiences in the conservative areas, especially the South, would not boycott or protest. They wanted to be able to reach these audiences that they knew would be against any kind of interracial romance or interracial relationship. That was an institutionalized way of preventing Asian American, as well as other actors of color, from achieving stardom, because, hey, there is going to be a role that's actually about an Asian American person, and yet we can't cast an Asian American actor to play that because of this code.
Oh, I come from the South, from way down south, where the corn and potatoes used to grow. There's a great big elegant picture show, and my old Kentucky home is a French chateau.
There were laws, though, against intermarriage, miscegenation. And in 1949, California allowed miscegenation. That was a landmark. But it wasn't until 1967 that interracial marriages were legalized throughout the U.S. in the Loving versus Virginia case, which was a black woman and a white man.
I feel like that's always been Hollywood's rationale for racism, because they always say that, well, it's the audiences. That is something that is from the institutionalization of the Hays Code all the way to today, where there is no Hays Code anymore, but there's still that catering to the conservative audience.
There are a lot of exceptions, some good films. Cecil B. DeMille made a film in 1915 called The Cheat, which is a good film, but the Japanese character is somewhat stereotypical.
So in the example of The Cheat, I find that really interesting because Setsue Hayakawa, who was actually he was a matinee idol. So he was actually seen as kind of sexy and interesting for audiences to come and see, but then always he was seen as the enemy, right? He branded a white woman in that movie, which is just, it's uncalled for. It seems obviously very barbarous. And at the same time, I think he was also exoticized, and there was intrigue about him. So that really captured the threat of the Asian, but also the kind of the draw and allure of someone who is so different from us, right?
Frank Capra made a great film, A Bit or Two of General Yen in 1933, which is about a Chinese general who's in love with Barbara Stanwyck. It's a daring film for its time because it's about interracial love, which is a huge taboo in American films, and he got away with it. And the Chinese general is played by a Swedish actor.
You've run down my rickshaw, boy!
Yes.
And, there were good Asian actresses around. They could have made more effort to find them. Anna May Wong had some career.
If you look back on Fu Manchu and Charlie Chan, these were series of films and television shows that kind of defined Asian Americans for so long, right? And they'll have different white actors actually switch in for those roles, right? And so it doesn't matter. You can put in like a million different kind of white actors for the same role, and yet they continue to reproduce the same kind of stereotype.
Christopher Lee as the dreaded Dr. Fu Manchu.
Then Dr. Ingrid Koch will die an extremely painful death.
Because he actually had prosthetics put in to make his eyes look more Asian, and so this is kind of still an example of Yellowface.
Humble self responsible for tip noticed large increase in number of secret agents since fleet ordered back to Pacific.
And you have someone like Charlie Chan, who I would argue is the predecessor to kind of the model minority of today, the kind of very non-expressive, has kind of these wise saying, like fortune cookie sayings, and is passive, but and so he was a very popular TV character.
70, 75. I got to slow it down, Mr. Chan.
Too bad. I was in hopes soon to overtake other car.
And so today, we still have, in my interviews with a casting director, one said that she said that it was common for casting directors to think of Asian actors as not very expressive.
You two are supposed to take baggage to hotel.
We did, Pops, then we came looking for you. You know we have to look after you.
The racism was so pervasive in American society, a lot of people didn't even think about it.
In fact, no trouble is too big for us.
Some of your trouble too big for me. Come, we must investigate slight case of murder.
Murder? Well, here I come. Here I go.
And that happened during, throughout kind of the wars with Asia. So it's really easy to kind of portray Asian, threat, right? In the same time that, that Asia is seen as the enemy.
When the war came, America was very slow to enter the war because isolationism was very strong in America. But Pearl Harbor galvanized people, and it is quite clear that Roosevelt wanted us to get into war. He knew that we had to defeat fascism in Europe.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
The record of American films is just appalling in that period, and The Purple Heart and other films just depict them as savages, and there are certain caricaturistic physical traits that they love to harp on.
The Japanese will win. He wears wood fiber clothes, cardboard shoes. He cheerfully eats 1/3 of his usual diet. He works 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And our soldiers, ask your troops at Bataan, we do not leave any place that we want. You must kill us. We will win this war because we are willing to sacrifice 10 million lives. How many lives is the white man willing to sacrifice?
I just watched Know Your Enemy Japan again, Capra's outrageous film, and it was just a nonstop parade of racist cliches.
He is prouder still of the fact that to be a soldier is the highest human achievement in Japan. He has been trained to be a soldier almost from birth, and into his tough little mind has been drilled and hammered the fanatical belief that Japanese are descendants of gods and destined to rule the earth and all who live on it. To this end, treachery, brutality, rape, and torture are all justified if used against non-Japanese.
And the films were made basically for two reasons. One was to motivate them to fight, because a lot of Americans didn't know why we were fighting. And then the other was to educate them in the reasons for fighting.
He lives on rice and fish, or occasionally rice and meat, but often on rice alone. And he's proud of it.
So they would make these films to pressurize people to do things in those days, and that's how it worked. There wasn't television as much, but there were motion pictures. They would show some of these in theaters.
There was an intentionality on the U.S. government to use Hollywood as propagandistic, right? So a lot of cartoons actually were used during World War II that portrayed the Japanese as enemy. I actually saw one where it was Bugs Bunny. It was called Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, and nips was a derogatory term for Japanese, and it portrayed them as, it was interesting because it portrayed them with really big feet. They were very animalistic, so they had the buck teeth and the glasses, but they also had. They were barefoot and had these really big feet, like they were animals, right? So it's really easy, I think, to portray an entire race as animals, in order to kind of then justify killing them, right? Justify marking them as an enemy, dehumanizing them.
Hurry, get them while they're cold. Here, one for you, monkey face. Here you are, slant eyes. Everybody gets one.
I would argue that the entertainment is even more dangerous than the obvious propaganda, right? Because when you're watching something as entertainment, you're not even looking at it critically. You're thinking, this is how it is, right? Because your filters are down. And actually, in the war effort, that entertainment is the best way to do propaganda. If you have Bugs Bunny, who's iconic, right? I mean, he was beloved. If Bugs Bunny, thinks the Japanese are enemy, then they must be enemies, right? So it's much more effective to have already established kind of movie stars or cartoon stars to kind of participate in the propaganda in ways that then the U.S. audience is going to consume without any filters and going to consume and believe that is real.
Cock-a-doodle-doo, please.
Even though Hollywood, it's not like we can say Hollywood made the Japanese enemies, it doesn't help when you have something going back to the cheat, right? You have something going back to Setsuo Hayakawa, who, despite being a matinee idol, was branding white women, right, on screen, and seen as a barbarous other, right? Always seen as other, never seen as an American. Even though, we had all these Japanese Americans as farmers, and, they were very much incorporated into the United States and working really hard and contributing to society, and yet that was never seen on screen.
There are a lot of really slurs against Japanese Americans and basically portraying them all as spies and disloyal. But a lot of the Japanese Americans were, they'd been here a long time, or at least a generation or two. The whole country was galvanized into war. And then Hitler declared war on the United States 2 days after our Congress declared war on Japan. But then very soon after that, in early 42, the planning started soon after Pearl Harbor to round up the Japanese Americans in California, especially, and other Western states, and put them in detention camps as enemy aliens, dangerous people. They put them in buses and trains and took them to these camps that were very minimal, way out in the middle of nowhere. The terrible irony, of course, is that there wasn't a single Japanese American who ever was convicted of spying for the Japanese during the war. It was an illusion. And they rounded these people up and put them in camps and took their homes away and their farms. And a lot of people think it was partly due to the racism of white farmers wanting their land, because these Japanese immigrants had done very well as farmers especially, and had a lot of property and were prosperous. So they took their land away, and they claimed they were going to save it for them, and they didn't. And a lot of them came back at the end of the war, and they found they had no property left. A number of Japanese were shot trying to escape or killed for various reasons.
So my family, the Tomita family, was interned in Manzanar. My family, they dressed up in their clothes to go to the assembly center, thinking that they were going to someplace special where they would be safe and protected. They didn't know they were going to the horse stalls. They didn't know that they were going to be living in where the horse shit would be, where hay was. They brought one suitcase each. They had to make their own beds of hay. One really great thing that I think my father and my uncles told me is that because my grandmother and grandfather, my Jichan Bachan, were farmers, that they didn't know what they were going to, that they brought seeds, packages of seeds, because they didn't know if they were going to get the kind of food they were going to be eating. It's Japanese, they prepare their cabbage, they prepare their lettuce, they prepare their tomatoes in very simple ways. They didn't know if they were going to get American food, which was in cans. That was a really very small detail, how they went to the bathroom. You know, there's no private toilets. There were just stalls for animals to go through. There were no partitions. There were no doors for women to go to the bathroom. There were these kinds of details that I asked my uncles. I asked so many people of certain ages who went to camp. How did they live? How did they survive? What are the details that they had? There's so many more stories that their farms were taken away, their houses were sold for $50. All my family lost everything. And the focus on proving themselves to be American is that they stopped speaking Japanese because they didn't want to be seen as being the enemy.
There were 10 WRA camps, War Relocation Authority camps, spread out throughout the United States, from Colorado, Mochi, Colorado, Heart Mountain, Wyoming, Poston, Arizona, California, Manzanar, Tule Lake, California, which eventually became a segregation camp for dissidents, Heart Mountain, Wyoming, where my father was put in a camp.
They were American citizens. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned, and 2/3 of those people were born here in the United States. So they were stripped of their civil rights and denied due process and basically imprisoned in barbed wire camps.
There were Japanese American boys whose families were interned. They were going off to fight, right, on behalf of the United States. So this kind of desire to prove their loyalty, despite the fact that their entire family was being imprisoned.
After the war and the release of the Japanese American internees, coming back to their hometown. So my family came back to Los Angeles, and they were housed in temporary housing barrack at the airport. But there were curfews in place because there were still restrictions as to their movement, that they couldn't, I believe they were not allowed to assemble in more than groups of 5. If there were more than, and I come from a family of 8, it's like if there was a group of 5 or more, they were suspicious. So there were a lot of restrictions immediately after the war that Japanese Americans couldn't get together and to organize and to find a living.
After the war, things started changing, because we wanted to be friends with our former enemies, which was smart because we learned a lesson from World War I. When the Allies punished Germany after the war, that was a terrible mistake. So the Japanese became our friends, and that's one of the great ironies of the post-war world. Also, they were demonizing the Russians because the Cold War was getting underway because as World War II was winding down, they started focusing on Russia is going to be our enemy. So there was a lot of paranoia. The prevailing theory today is we dropped the atomic bombs on Japan because we were trying to intimidate Russia. We really didn't have to drop the bombs. Japan was basically defeated. But the Russians were about to enter the war and we wanted to scare them off. We wanted to be friends with Germany and Japan. And of course, we ruled those two countries for years. You know, we were the occupying forces, and so we rewrote their constitutions and we ran those countries and changed their cultures and everything.
But what about the troops that are arriving on Okinawa today? What will they find on this, our most important military base in the Far East? They will find a modern community, in many respects very similar to many communities in America. They will find a place where they can make a home for their family and live as Americans are usually accustomed to. In all this, the Okinawans have learned much of Western men. They have learned new skills, discovered a higher standard of living, and enjoyed new forms of recreation. But how has all this activity affected the Okinawans? Under American guidance, the island has turned into a prosperous, modern community.
They started showing us the Japanese were like us, they were our friends, and they loved baseball.
But the soldier didn't have to understand it all to appreciate it. And in his appreciation of the things Japan had to offer, he earned the goodwill of the Japanese people, as well as finding pleasure himself in the enjoyment of new experiences.
All of a sudden, you know, Japan is now an ally, and also I think there's more understanding. Also, it's interesting because I think that post-war, when the soldiers come back, right? So then they're starting to bring back knowledge of their time in Asia or their time interacting with Asians. That there's greater understanding, and especially when the geopolitical kind of movement changes and the tides shift, when all of a sudden this group that was our enemy is now our ally.
The American Army made a rather silly film around that time, which is somewhat similar. It's called Japanese Bride in America. And it's a propaganda film meant to show, you know, it's an acted film with a good actress playing this Japanese bride who comes home with a young American husband.
In 1945, after the war had ended, I met an American soldier named Walter Lutz. We fell in love.
Everything is nice. Everybody's nice. The only thing that happens that's negative is they're walking down the street and some lady gives her a dirty look, and then the narrator says, oh, well, she was upset, but this woman's son had been killed in Iwo Jima, so my wife understood how she felt. Okay, that's it, you know.
We did get a look of real resentment from one woman. She had lost a son at Iwo Jima. Miwako was disturbed, but when I explained, she understood. I knew she was still feeling a little strange, and I thought some new clothes might make her feel better. So we went shopping.
It was much worse in some cases for Japanese women trying to adapt. They really tried to assimilate, but they weren't always accepted.
The Mrs. Lutz has become a second mother to me.
In Hollywood history, it's always about fantasy. It's about sexual fantasy. It's about love fantasies.
How do you do and welcome? My name is Miko Taka. I have been asked to tell you about a motion picture called Sayonara. Sayonara was photographed on actual location in Japan. The word sayonara means goodbye, and yet it means so much more, as you'll discover when you see this entirely different motion picture.
That wonderful romantic movie where an American soldier goes over and falls in love with a Takarazuka dancer. It was a romantic film. You know, we have the true Romeo and Juliet kind of tragic history, the story that happens between the Red Buttons character and the Miyoshi Umeki character. But then you get the strong, handsome, heroic American soldier played by Marlon Brando, basically falling in love and loving Japanese culture through Japanese women.
I have never been in love, but I have dreamed about it.
And it's the fantasy of women in the beautiful geisha makeup. And Takarazuka is a very, very high-polished art form. She's an entertainer. She's skilled in dance. She's skilled in singing. And my mother still loves the fact that there was a Hollywood movie starring Marlon Brando and he falls in love with the geisha because it romanticizes Japan.
Sayonara. Goodbye. I'm sure we'll meet again soon.
They are not prostitutes. They are not prostitutes. Geishas do not equal prostitutes. But somehow, in 2018, it's still that kind of belief still exists that Japanese women dressed in the beautiful geisha with the white makeup and the painted red lips that are very small but very petite, with the kimono, with the fan, with everything. That's a very, very beautiful, but it's a very specific type of Japanese cultured woman. It seems to have impacted the impression of what Japanese women are. The Barbarian and the Geisha, the horrible John Wayne movie, where again, the white man is going to rescue the Japanese woman and take the beautiful Japanese flower of a woman, you know, to be his loving wife, to be his subservient wife.
America, so far away.
Not so far away that I'll forget you. Every time I see a woman with ornaments in her hair, I'll think of Okichi with the yellow combs.
But, of course, the romanticization falls into cliche and it falls into prejudice. It falls into not the racial kind of prejudice where it's, you know, that Japanese women are it becomes, they're all delicate flowers, that we all know how to dance, that we all serve tea, that we're all very genteel. We need to tell a little bit more truthful portrayals of Japanese, but also we just need to portray people who are just regular people who have nothing to do with their culture. It's like I'm as an American as, you know, the girl next door.
There are some outrageous examples. Probably the most extreme is Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's, where he plays this very, very extreme, silly Japanese caricature. And it's a good film, and then he's otherwise, suddenly he appears from time to time as Mr. Yunioshi, and it's really embarrassing today.
Won't you join me?
Yes, join Audrey Hepburn as you've never seen her before.
Breakfast at Tiffany's. I think that was one of the most popular movies of its time. Audrey Hepburn's so glamorous, except that it's got one of the worst caricatures of Japanese Americans and Japanese people in the history of Yellowface, right? So we have Mickey Rooney, who is a white, you know, very famous white musical, you know, very huge star, playing a Japanese character, and he's got the buck teeth, the black, you know, glasses, and he's wearing a kimono. He's walking around really strange, bumps into things because, you know, Asians are clumsy or something. So it's this the kind of bumbling idiot, right? And also speaks with a very heavy, exaggerated accent.
But that was 2 weeks ago. You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell.
It really makes me so angry. It makes me so angry that the depiction of Mickey Rooney, who has since apologized, as well as Blake Edwards, for that nasty impression of a Japanese man It just makes me so angry that that was deemed as funny, that was deemed as hysterical, that was deemed as humorous. And I saw it and I go, what the fuck is this? This is a Japanese man. He has nothing to do with what my father is or my grandfather is or so many Japanese or Japanese American men I know. It was such an embarrassment. The two examples of Marlon Brando in Teahouse, the August Mooning playing Sekini and Mickey Rooney is that they're playing Japanese men, pulling their eyes to squinty, wearing bad yellow makeup, and putting on a very, very, very bad accent.
Marlon Brando, whose talents have ranged from William Shakespeare to Damon Runyon, is out of this world as Sakini.
Sakini here, boss.
Don't ever put your finger on an officer.
It's a little confusing and disturbing, but as long as we know that it's only a moment in time these Hollywood films take place, it's a picture, it's a photograph, it's a Polaroid of how we wanted to tell stories in that particular time and place.
Sakini.
Yes, boss.
You are a civilian employee in the pay of the United States Army and should dress accordingly.
Yeah.
Pull your socks up.
Very sorry, boss. Very sorry. Socks up. Anything more, boss?
That'll be all. Is that as fast as you can walk?
No, no, boss. But to walk any faster, socks fall down.
And that's how I've always felt growing up and watching these old films, is that they didn't really understand who Japanese people were. They didn't really understand who Chinese Americans were. They just saw them as other. Korean War started to open up the world to more bigger audiences, and that we want to see more stories dealing with these beautiful places, because we've already championed them. We won over, the Japanese in World War II. We won in the Korean War. We won in the Korean War, and we're entering the Vietnam War. It's that we're trying to see how we're becoming a little bit more global, a little bit more educated.
And also, I think greater recognition with getting closer to the civil rights era, that there is just more, also like during the civil rights era, there was also a third world movement. So as you're moving closer to the Vietnam War, the young people are starting to have a greater understanding of geopolitics and starting to rebel against kind of older sentiments of seeing these parts of the world as enemy, right? Or this group of people, like people of color, as enemy, and women's rights. And I think that there's just the beginning of kind of an awakening of oh, we have issues. So a lot of these race movies came out. So even kind of Crimson Kimono.
The sensational murder of Sugar Torch, burlesque queen, triggers a manhunt in the teeming streets of Little Tokyo in Los Angeles and fires a turbulent love story between an American girl and a Japanese boy.
You mean you want to marry her? You wouldn't have said it that way if I were white.
One of the most interesting films is Samuel Fuller's The Crimson Kimono, which came out in 1958. It was about two policemen in Los Angeles investigating a crime in Little Tokyo, which is a part of downtown LA where a lot of Japanese people had lived and had businesses. And one of these detectives is Japanese American and one is white Anglo guy. And the white woman in the film winds up with the Japanese American guy. She prefers him to the white guy. And they kiss, and that was a big deal, and nobody else was doing that kind of thing.
It can never work out, Chris. If he feels like that, what can I expect from you?
Everything. Because I love you.
Fuller was a tough-minded guy who understood social issues, and he was not afraid of controversies, and he loved plunging into controversies. Very liberal guy, very democratic.
But it was a very personal movie to Samuel Fuller. He wanted to show a romance between a Japanese-American male and a white American female, which really hadn't been done before. And he tried to sell the idea to Sam Briskin, who was the producer there. And Sam, as to be expected in 1959, he wasn't exactly thrilled by the idea. He was saying, well, you know, you're gonna have to make the white cop, who's the third part of the triangle, a bad guy. But Samuel Fuller resisted. He wanted them both to be good cops.
Back in the 50s, this was a dicey thing.
Living with you here like this brings dishonor on them. And they hate any of us who give that impression to foreigners.
Sam led the way with House of Bamboo, deals with complex relationships between Americans and Japanese after the war.
You don't tell them the truth, they're gonna get rid of me, understand? Now, what's my name?
Then he realizes there are issues that come up, and conflicts, and sexual conflicts, and personal conflicts, and so he deals with them honestly.
I don't want anything to happen to you.
But they're refreshing today because they seem much more modern, like we think today. Like, oh, okay, these are human conflicts, and there's no bias that Sam had against any ethnic group or anything. And that's so refreshing because, I mean, Hollywood has just a terrible history of mistreating ethnic groups of all kinds.
In 1988 and 1989, I had the great opportunity to film the piece Come See the Paradise, written and directed by the British director Alan Parker.
No, 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 no! Talk to me, Mama.
It was a depiction of a true story, but based with fictional characters that Alan Parker was inspired to write about, dealing with the Japanese-American internment camps.
My wife is an American citizen, sir.
You think the camps are wrong?
Yes, sir, I do.
Camp? You call this a camp? This is a damn outdoor jail!
It was written and made and directed by a British director, Alan Parker, who was successful in getting 20th Century Fox to finance the film about a Japanese-American family and the girl of that family falling in love with a Caucasian union laborer played by Dennis Quaid. And he saw that as an opportunity to tell a horrific chapter of American history. And being a non-American, I think he had a more objective point of view, looking at America as a nation of many cultures, but that the government can do that to a certain group of people.
This is America, pal, so remember, you're an American. We're at war now.
What are you talking about?
Ain't you heard? The Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor.
Come See the Paradise is the only film on the Japanese-American concentration camps. But again, we also have to remember that it was made in 1990. And so we're here in 2018, and we can do better, and hopefully it will provoke, it will inspire, it will impact other filmmakers to make not only films on Japanese-American internment, but other historical events that really have shaped our country's notion and impression of ourselves, as well as around the world. So,
Jack, listen. She's Japanese, Jack. Yeah, we'll find you a nice American girl.
What I can never be, not ever, is Japanese. But I couldn't love Lily more.
And partly the problem is there's just not enough representation. Even during the Cold War era, we could still list like 3 or 4, movies at most, right? And so when people are basing those images, their ideas of Japanese Americans or Asian Americans just on like 4 or 5 films, it's problematic, right? Because those images can't stand in for the diversity of experiences. I mean, if you think about Asia, it is a huge, huge region with so many different cultures, different languages. I mean, in Asia, people don't think of themselves as Asian. They think of themselves as Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipino.
A lot of people see, especially in Middle America, especially in pockets of the world where they don't get a chance to meet persons of a particular culture. Film is that important. It's perhaps their only education sometimes in introducing themselves to the world. On August 15th, 2018, Crazy Rich Asians is coming to the screen. And that's going to be the first time in a long time where we get to see an Asian fellow fall in love with an Asian girl. And that's kind of novel, especially for a Hollywood film. So as persons of Asian descent, not only here in America, but we're looking forward to the success of that film because it's a little bit more real.
Kevin Kwan, who is an Asian American author who wrote this, New York Times bestseller book, when they decided to make a film adaptation, people asked him if they could make the lead, who is a Chinese American woman who goes to Asia, right? Because she's like, oh my gosh, these crazy rich Asians, I'm just Asian American. What is this about? They wanted to make her white. Right? They asked if they could make her white. And he's like, you've missed the entire point of my novel. And he, as an Asian American writer, can say like, no, I don't want that to be the adaptation of my story. I mean, like growing up as a young person, and so it's happening now that I'm older, but I'm so glad that young Asian American women are going to be able to at least see one representation of themselves. Asian stereotypes are probably one of the long-lasting ones from the beginning to now, where it's only until recent, I think, that people are really seeing an uproar. And I think that it's because Asian Americans are really taking to social media. They're starting to organize more, and they are making a fuss. And we have allies, right, from other groups of color who say we don't want to see whitewash characters. We actually want to see Asian actors playing. We want to see a Japanese actress play, the major in Ghost in the Shell. We don't want to see Scarlett Johansson, right? If you put all people of color together, they are actually an incredible, powerful audience that will make or break a show. And also the idea that white audiences won't watch won't watch shows with people of color. For example, Black Panther. I mean, that has done well internationally, right? So that's just not true. It's a lie that Hollywood still perpetuates based on what it's believed in the past. We are the leads of our own rom-coms, right, in our own lives, but never seeing that on screen is really problematic, and you just feel completely alienated, literally, right? We're seen as others, and we feel ourselves that we don't belong in the kind of fabric of the American narrative, so.